Nowadays, the use of fingerprints to aid in catching criminals is familiar and rarely questioned, but it wasn't always so. Once upon a time, this technology was new, untested, and untrusted, and it has only become part of modern crime fighting thanks to some early instances of its use which proved its efficacy. In today's video from History Calling, we're going to start by looking at the first murder solved by fingerprints, and be warned, it has a shocking twist in it. I'll then tell you about two subsequent famous historical murder cases which have also gained notoriety thanks to what was then the innovative use of these little ridges on our hands to prove who the culprits in these heinous crimes were. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube lets you know every time I upload. You can also follow me on Instagram, which is linked in the description box below. The first case in the world in which fingerprints were used to identify a murderer occurred in the coastal town of Necochea, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that, in Argentina on the 29th of June 1892. It was actually a double murder of the two young children of Francesca Rojas, who had been found killed in their beds. Unfortunately, when you research this case online, there are numerous versions of the story with often conflicting details and very little primary evidence available. As I've discussed on my channel before, I absolutely hate using secondary sources to gather up details of historical events, and this is an excellent example of why. However, I did find a book about an early pioneer of forensic science, which was written in 1956, and which mentioned in passing that the official records of this case had been lost. So, assuming that that is true, it would certainly explain why there are so many variations in the story. As I therefore can't access much in the way of original source material, I've had to use secondary works here. Given the problem with this approach, I'm therefore going to stick to the basic facts of the case, which the various retellings have in common, and flag up some of the inconsistencies in the stories where appropriate. Okay, with that disclaimer in mind, let's carry on. The two children, either two boys or a boy and a girl named Ponciano and Felicia, aged 6 and 4, were killed in their home, possibly by blunt force trauma or having their throats cut. Whether their mother was married or not changes depending on who tells the story, but for reasons we'll get to in a minute, I think she was either unmarried or separated from her husband, whose surname may have been de Caraballo, as she is sometimes called Francesca Rojas de Caraballo. She either found the children or was found with them with a superficial cut to her own neck, and she quickly blamed a local man, Pedro Velasquez, who she said had killed her offspring either because she rejected his advances or because she prevented him from taking the children to give to their father. He was arrested, interrogated, for which we tortured, and some secondary sources even claim he was locked in a room overnight with the children's bodies to try to force a confession, but he refused to budge. Furthermore, it soon emerged that he had an alibi. Progress was only made in the case when an outside detective was brought in. This was either a Croatian immigrant named Juan Vucetich, who was then pioneering the use of fingerprints for identification, or one of his associates named Edward Alvarez. When the new detective went to look at the murder scene, despite it being several days old, he noticed a bloody fingerprint on the doorway of the room in which the children had been found. This double child murder now took a shocking twist. He had the piece of wood cut out and the fingerprint examined, and when it was compared to the prints of the children's mother, who said that she had not touched the bodies and so couldn't have had their blood on her, it was a match. When confronted with the evidence, Francesca broke down and admitted that she had killed her own children and faked her injuries because her lover did not want to marry a woman who already had children. This is another reason I think she was unmarried or separated, despite what some of the secondary sources claim. An image of her original fingerprint card can be found in the US National Library of Medicine and is seen here. As far as I can tell, she was convicted in 1894 and sentenced to a lengthy stay in prison. The Rojas case had opened the door, albeit slowly, for other murder cases around the world to be solved using the perpetrator's fingerprints, and in 1905 the United Kingdom used this new technique in a case known as the mask murders. This wasn't the first time fingerprints had been used in court in Great Britain, as they had helped to convict a burglar by the name of Harry Jackson in 1902, but this was their first use in a murder trial, and the story was widely covered by contemporary newspapers. The victims were Thomas and Anne Farrow, an elderly married couple from Deptford who ran an oil shop on the high street there. On the morning of the 27th of March 1905, an employee of theirs arrived at their shop and was surprised to find it still closed. Concerned for their well-being, he and another local businessman forced their way inside and found Thomas Farrow on the floor, bludgeoned to death, and his wife clinging to life in the bedroom of the flat above the shop. She would die a few days later from similar injuries and without regaining consciousness. 2 black masks made of old stockings were found on the premises, which is how the case got the name the Mask Murders, and the contents of the cash box, amounting to the considerable sum of £13, were missing. Crucially though, the box itself remained, and a thumb mark could be seen on it. Robbery was obviously the motive, and as no forced entry was found, it was surmised that Mr. Farrow had been tricked into opening the door to his murderers sometime during the night or early morning. Witnesses who had seen 2 men leaving the shop at around 7 a.m, one of them wearing a brown jacket with brown boots, allowed the search to be narrowed to 2 local criminals, brothers Alfred and Albert Stratton, aged 22 and 20. Alfred's girlfriend, Annie Cromarty, said that she had noticed that he had had a bath when he arrived home at about 9 a.m. on the 27th of March, which was an unusual occurrence for him. Furthermore, his brown jacket had disappeared. He rather lamely said he'd given it away to a beggar out of the kindness of his heart, and he was blacking up his brown boots, which we might surmise was to hide the fact that he owned brown boots or to cover up the blood on them. He also told her that he had buried £4 close to the nearby waterworks, which he could not relocate, but which the police later found. Again, this was a huge sum of money for a young man with no employment to have suddenly acquired. Meanwhile, Albert's girlfriend, Kate Wade, said that he had asked her for some old stockings not long before the murder, and their landlady, a Mrs. Stedman, said that she had found and binned some masks which resembled those ultimately used in the crime. Both Annie and Kate said in court that upon hearing the descriptions of the suspects shortly after the murders, they almost immediately suspected the brothers were to blame. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but it would prove to be the thumb mark on the cash box that sealed the deal. Upon comparison with the brothers' prints, it was a match for Alfred, with 11 distinguishing marks noted. The brothers were found guilty of the murders and sentenced to death. They were hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 23rd of May that year. We now come to the United States, which wasn't far behind in recognising the use of fingerprints for catching criminals. Its first successful conviction using such evidence came in 1910 and related to a murder which had occurred in Chicago, Illinois 2 months earlier. On that night, the 19th of September, Clarence B. Hiller had gone to bed in his home, which he shared with his wife and 4 children. The eldest of these were called Clarice, aged 15, and Florence, aged 13. Each of these girls had her own bedroom upstairs in the house, while their 2 younger siblings slept in the same room as their parents. At around 2 a.m. on the 19th of September, Clarice awoke to see the form of a man in her bedroom doorway, but assumed it was her father and wasn't concerned. The man then went into her sister's room, where he groped the terrified girl. Meanwhile, their mother had awoken and noticed that the gas light usually kept burning in the hallway was out, and alerted her husband to the fact. He went to investigate and encountered the intruder in the hallway. There was a struggle, and Hiller was shot and killed at the bottom of the stairs at around 2:25 a.m. Alerted by screams from the household, neighbours and local police officers were soon on the scene, where they recovered 3 unused revolver cartridges and the 2 spent bullets which had passed through Mr. Hiller's body. Sand and gravel was also found near the bottom of Florence's bed. Barely 15 minutes later, a man named Thomas Jennings was stopped by 4 policemen 3/4 of a mile away from the murder scene, covered in blood, perspiring, with torn clothing, a fresh injury on his wrist, and in possession of a loaded revolver. They took the weapon off him, and apparently finding his explanations as to how he had come to be in this state and what he was doing in this location at 2:40 a.m. unconvincing, they took him to the police station. It was soon discovered that he had sand in his shoes, just like that found in Florence's bedroom, and that his revolver had been recently fired and used bullets of the same caliber as those which had killed Hiller. Eyewitnesses would also place someone matching his general description in the vicinity of the murder scene just before the killing occurred, as there had been several other break-ins that night before the incident at the Hiller's house, and one man had even torn his assailant's coat pocket in the same manner that Jennings' coat was torn. The suspect also had a previous criminal record for burglary, for which he had recently been released from prison on parole. Now we get to the fingerprint evidence. The Hiller house had recently been painted, with the back porch the last thing done and only just completed. The killer had gained entrance to the home by coming in through the kitchen window, which backed onto the porch, after first removing the screen. In so doing, he had left several fingerprints in the fresh paint on the railing of the porch. This railing was removed and photographed hours after the murder, and when the prints on it were compared to those of Jennings, 4 experts agreed that they were a match. He was found guilty of killing Clarence Hiller and sentenced to death in November 1910. He launched an appeal in the Illinois Supreme Court, arguing in part that fingerprint evidence shouldn't have been admissible, but this was rejected, with one of the reasons given being that such evidence was already successfully used in the United Kingdom. Jennings was executed by hanging on the 16th of February 1912. Writing in a blog entry for that same court, John A. Lupton, who is a member of the Supreme Court Historic Preservation Commission, has said that, by the end of the 1920s, all state courts followed their reasoning in the Jennings case, showing the long-lasting importance of this conviction and its use of fingerprint evidence. To conclude, none of these cases relied solely on fingerprints. Rojas admitted to killing her children, and there was significant circumstantial evidence in the Stratton and Jennings cases, all of which pointed to those men as the murderers. Fingerprints were just one part of the puzzle, but they were a part never used in murder trials in these countries before, and they set a precedent for the reliability of fingerprints, which continues to this day. This is despite the fact that there have been occasional incidents in which people have been wrongly identified using such evidence, sometimes because of partial prints or because of sloppy comparison work. Despite these errors, fingerprints are now generally viewed as a highly reliable piece of evidence in criminal cases, and that seems unlikely to change. But it all started in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with these landmark cases. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the early history of fingerprints in murder trials around the world. Before I leave you, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my patrons for their support of this channel, which helps me to keep creating videos for you. If you'd like to become a patron and get some History Calling perks, see the Patreon link in the description box below. My Time Traveller patrons this week will be getting to see one of the main sources I used for the Jennings case, for instance. If you would prefer to make a one-off donation for any reason, YouTube also have a thanks button below the video with preset amounts which will enable you to do just that. This allows you to post a customizable and brightly coloured comment and get a one-time animation over the top of the video. Let me know in the comments too if you think convictions could have been secured in any of these cases without the fingerprint evidence. I'll be back next week with a new video, and until then, keep learning.